Literary Reading, Part 1, Reading in General. We all know what reading is, right? Using eyes or fingers, maybe ears too with audiobooks, to decode language. It also might be argued that we read other things besides language, such as film, facial expressions, and patterns of activity occurring in the world. Reading involves a text or message, written by an author or communicator, and read by a reader or audience. This interaction occurs in a reading context that may have only the text in common with the writer's context. Reading is not a spectator sport. According to scholar Louise Rosenblatt, reading is a transaction, which means that readers bring their own experiences and beliefs with them into the reading encounter, changing the meaning of the text as they read. For this reason, there is never one way to read a text. Our class dialogue is enriched by each individual's contribution to the dialogue about a text. Simultaneously, the reading experience changes the reader. Based on our reading, we may think in new ways and make different choices. As William Deresiewicz argues about the humanities in general, reading is one path to freedom because reading allows us to examine the world without undue self-influence. We can wrestle with life-changing ideas safely and without bias in this intellectual and emotional space. Patience and engagement with reading are gifts to the person you will become. When scientists collect evidence in preparation for drawing conclusions, they attempt to separate observation from inference. That is, they attempt to separate what they observe about an event based on sensory input from what they infer or guess about an event based on that sensory input. For example, in looking at the image, this image, what might you observe about it? Noting that the object depicted appears to be a helmet is a conclusion, not an observation or even an inference. That conclusion requires a number of linked observations and inferences to be made before the observer can arrive at the conclusion. One might observe a raised line moving from top to bottom of the object that seems to curve slightly, based on which one might infer a curved surface. The surface itself is wrinkled or pitted, based on which one might perhaps infer that it is made of metal, that it has been beaten with a hammer. One might also observe that the object is lighter colored than the background, except where it falls into shadow, based on which one might also infer the object is made from a gray-colored metal, perhaps photographed against a display backdrop and under museum lighting. These inferences, based on the evidence observed, lead to the conclusion that the object is a helmet, except that it is not. Observations of additional evidence help observers arrive at more accurate conclusions. Understanding the difference between observation and inference helps observers track the strengths and weaknesses of a previous conclusion. The observations were correct if incomplete. The inferences were not. Making this chain of logic visible helps observers improve reasoning. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We run through the same process of evidence, observation, inference, and conclusion whenever we encounter new information, whether we are conscious of doing so or not. And so here's another example. Our eyes immediately move to the place where the orange and blue columns overlap. We observe only orange columns increasing in height to that point, and we observe a slightly higher blue column than only blue columns increasing in height after that point. Then our eyes move to the labels that help us determine what the columns represent. Based on the visual data, we infer that in the 15th century, the printing press suddenly caused the extinction of manuscripts, and within 300 years the quantity of books multiplied by 1,000. Given these inferences, we conclude that the printing press revolutionized book production almost overnight. The steps involved in reading literary texts are similar to those involved in examining other kinds of scientific evidence. Readers read evidence and make observations and inferences in order to draw conclusions about the reading.